both for coming. Before we say a few words about Steve Thorne, I just want to remind you that next week we're having a symposium on course program sharing for sustainability. A symposium at Columbia, Friday from 5 to 8, which is the keynote reception, and then an all-day event 9 to 5 on Saturday with 3 panels with people discussing various models for course and sharing arrangements around the country, many of them funded by me. So please come. If you want to come, I would simply urge you to RSVP, simply so that we know how much alcohol to for the reception. I don't know how many of you, I know some of you have had the pleasure of listening to our guest before, and those of you who have know that no matter what, his presentations never leave you or the audience indifferent. In one way or another, Steve's deeply felt and passionate engagement with whatever topic he chooses to discuss will affect you. Steve can in turn startle you, he can inspire you, motivate you, invigorate you, galvanize, energize you, but he can also at times irritate you or even antagonize you. But one thing he will never do is bore you or leave you apathetic. His areas of interest are as broad as they are eclectic. And this is just a brief kind of overview of some of them, and not all of them. They include topics such as formative intervention in world language education context, intercultural communications, indigenous language revitalization, communication across new media and mobile technologies, and research that draws upon contextual traditions of language analysis and uses based approaches to language developments. He's published heavily in all of these fields. Today, Steve has chosen to talk to us about living languages, or living language, and Effortful engagement as a catalyst for language learning. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. So thank you for the gracious opportunity to present and engage with you all here. I love the reference Stefan made earlier to, I think it was perhaps our most recent opportunity to kind of hang out and do some thinking together, which was in South Africa, where in fact there was a rather significant disagreement that I was part of with a colleague.
That's okay, I irritated him as well. So.
Yeah, exactly, but it was great. We sometimes learn and benefit from conflict, and I certainly was able to revisit some of my ideas through that dynamic as well. So, hey, thanks for being here, as I said. We are going to talk about a number of things today, and I'll begin with something that is rooted at least partly in New York. Do any of you recognize this individual, just out of curiosity? It's a quiz, yes, and you're failing. It's difficult to describe Tinos at all. He is a performance artist, but he also works in theater. He sells his work to museums. But his work is ephemeral. His work involves the social relational dynamics of confrontation, antagonism, breaking of frames of expectation in a way that provokes. So he situates all of his performance art work in museum spaces. And the reason for this is people come into the museum, and what do you do in a museum? Look around. What else do you do in a museum? Or what don't you do in a museum?
Talk loud.
Talk loud. Get antagonized by someone coming up saying, "You, we're dancing right now, come upstairs," right? You don't get any of this in a museum. It's distantiated reflection around objects that have been situated, assembled in very particular fashion, right? That are meant to be objects of reflection rather than catalysts for action. And I think we suffer, perhaps, in instructed language contexts and also in foreign language contexts from this museumification of ideas about language, right? So language is some of you who've thought with me before, language is a really important idea, but it's only an idea. The only thing that actually exists on some significant ontological level is communicative action and its residual. So you can have written forms or videotape stuff, but the only thing ever happening linguistically is language production, reception, and the ways in which that consolidates and makes possible various kinds of social relations, right? That's all that really exists. Otherwise, language is just an idea. So this notion of thinking about ways, borrowing from Tino Segal, to really push us, to reframe what might be happening in these interactional contents of classroom spaces is, I think, an interesting one. So here's Tino's notion of museum. Fantastically interesting, right? Inside this temple of objects, I refocus attention to human relations. And I love this. So he has these interpreters who come and engage with people in these museum spaces, totally breaking the frame. And since we're in New York, I included this Jerry Salt's commentary on his work. Fascinating, right? I've seen many shows I don't like. Never before have I seen a show that did not like me, right? And so rather than the idea of language, I'd like to think about rooting linguistically mediated developmental processes also limbically, experientially, in ways that actually kind of evoke broader human developmental processes. So I've restricted myself to three theoretical points that I'd like to begin with today. The first is this. All right, who's ready after all that build-up? All right. Okay, watch.
That's the kid, buddy. Jump to the branch.
Okay, here we go. Watch right now. All right, good. Okay.
Stop it.
Why am I showing you this, right? Now, there is a caption, which is mediation, visibilization, and amplification. That's the caption here. Who knows what this is, by the way? Is this a regular bike? With cranks, with pedals? No, it's a scoot bike, balance bike, it's called different things, right? What is the nature of that mediational tool that differs from a regular bicycle?
Teaches you about.
So, and how does it do that? It doesn't have cranks or pedals. What happens when you're on a trike or a bike with training wheels?
You don't have to balance.
You don't have to balance. Can you ride a bike without pedaling well?
Those things.
So the idea here is two kids, right? I have three now, right? But two kids, one was 4.5, one was 2.5. The 4.5-year-old still couldn't ride a bike without training wheels. The 2.5-year-old never had training wheels and used this balance bike and became a cyclist pedaling at 2.5. So you have a halving of the time, fundamentally, of the ability to learn how to ride a bike based on the mediational means used. Now, we do this in language education all the time. We try and make salient and visible kinds of semiotic resources that we think are going to help students first be aware of and subsequently learn or incorporate, internalize new communicative resources. And fundamentally, that is what language education should be about, is helping to really enhance opportunities to visibilize these sorts of linguistic assets that are going to serve them in very particular kinds of ways. The other thing I wanted to mention about this experiential basis for language learning is everything pretty much about human development involves neuroplasticity, and experience trains or creates conditions under which learning happens. Now, this may seem a trivial point, but one of the greatest living language acquisition experts, Michael Tomasello, has described something that seems commonsensical. All linguistic knowledge derives from the reception and production of forms of language at a particular time and in a particular place, right? What this means is no learning is outside of time and place. So everything that we do involves engineering conditions under which learning is more likely to happen, and learning trajectories are more powerfully enactable. So this idea of thinking about the engineering of the conditions for learning are critically important. The notion that supports this is thinking, learning, cognition more generally has something to do with circuits of neural activation in the brain. But contemporary approaches to cognition, involve notions of cognition as enacted, things you do, notions of cognition as extended to various aspects of the built environment, or mobile phones, for example. If you're at the store and you're trying to remember what to buy, you may have a list. So quite literally at that moment in time, your memory is distributed between things that you actually have internalized and an external resource, right? So this notion of thinking about curricula, about design, about classroom interactions, about kinds of activities that people engage in, become part of the extended, embedded, situated, and enacted notion that is now the very appropriate and I think contemporary way in which people in cognitive science as well as cognitive neuroscience and developmental studies think about learning, development, and human interactivity with and through aspects of the built surround high technologies, etc. So this means that we are really confronted with the responsibility to create these conditions for learning in very particular kinds of ways. And many of you are already doing great things. But I would like to encourage us today to think as Pavel Curtis, the very prominent computer scientist, like to ask all the time, your code is elegant, it's beautiful, what would something better look like, right? And when you start thinking about that, you have to think about the kinds of things we teach. Do we teach quote-unquote language, right? Or do we teach patterns or aspects of a lexicon? Michael Tomasello, who I mentioned earlier, has described very clearly and through deep empirical investigation that all human language is fundamentally pragmatics-oriented. Language is a kind of social action, right? And this idea of how do we engineer conditions under which the most important things about language learning become available. So I'll talk about a number of things today in terms of concrete specific projects. We'll start from the inside out. And we'll work first in an area, or I'll show you some projects in an area that are specifically rooted in kinds of things you can do in classes that are intact, that are bounded, that are meeting on campus, etc. A second level, we'll look at what you can do within a classroom community, but that articulates between what happens in classes and what might happen outside of classroom context. And the reason for thinking about out-of-class activity and sort of creating a lamination approach whereby inside and outside of class activity can commingle or help create larger volumes of effortful engagement is that we only have, what do you have here at Columbia, 50 or so hours a term of contact time, 45, 55, right? How many hours does it take to gain mastery based on the learning sciences and expertise literature?
10,000.
10,000, right? That's the common one that people talk about. So we have to do something about extending the volumes of effortful engagement that our participants can engage in. So we'll talk about mobile place-based learning, and online intercultural interaction, and of course about language learning in the wild, which is part of my Newark research project. And we'll conclude with this idea of how to think about bridging between classroom activity and out-of-class engagement in ways that amplify learning potential. Okay, so we all know that many things have happened in the last 25 years since the broad advent of the internet and its availability. We have all types of both textual communication, some forms of textual communication which seem trivial and everyday now, such as synchronous written communication. Obviously never happened before, right? These were not possible before about 25 or 30 years ago, at least not in a broad way. We have online video conferencing. Many of you have social media feeds that might be plurilingual and look something like this. We have all types of avatar-driven three-dimensional environments, from massive multiplayer games to open persistent spaces. Second Life, which I was never a fan of, is re-articulating itself. Linden Labs is reproducing a new virtual environment, which is a little bit more interesting. We'll have to see how that plays out. And we don't have to go through all these numbers, but you may or may not use some of these tools, but many of our students do. And of course, they begin this process extremely early. This happens to be my daughter, who, by the way, was a really shitty typist. Here's this age, I have to say. So let's look at some case studies starting from this inside out. And we'll start with something that I hope is very familiar to you. People here have worked on or with project-based approaches to language. Yeah, have you been doing this in your courses? A little, yeah, I know as well. I mean, it's a difficult thing to do, to think about ways to really have participants take time from other class activities, especially since you're oftentimes teaching in a tiered sequence. So you're teaching second year and you have to prepare students for third year, or you're teaching fifth semester, sixth semester, and there's someone immediately before and after that you have to align with. But project-based learning has been an extremely powerful approach that has helped to combine kinds of activities, kinds of communicative engagements that would be relevant in workplace settings, or in more elaborated communicative enterprises such as thesis design and development, writing for publication, etc. And it's based, if you look at the Buck Institute, which is arguably one of the better sites for thinking about approaches to project-based learning, across these 7 criteria. And you can see them here. The key piece for me is a public product, a shareable product, something that takes an activity that would have normally been in the classroom context and make it available to a broader audience. And many of you are already working in this area, I am guessing. Recently, there was a very large participant study in the hundreds of thousands that looked at success as a function of things that happen at the undergraduate level. So kinds of coursework, kinds of opportunities you have for engagement at the undergraduate level as related to graduation, as related to graduate or professional schools following the completion of your BA or BS, and as related to, was a longitudinal study, to income and other sort of indices of success, right? Two things correlated most strongly. One, mentorship, right? That you looked up to someone, that you had someone who cared about you as more than a student in a class of 50 or 60, or in languages maybe 15, 20, 25 if we're lucky, right? That was one piece. Second piece, having a project that extended beyond one course or one term. Something you did. So for many students, this would be a thesis. For other students in the sciences, it would be being part of a lab group where you were working on longer term projects. So the professor would have something going on and you would work on it maybe for 8 or 10 months or a year or 2 years, right, while you were an undergraduate, right? For other students, it was an opportunity to actually engage in the community. So community-based learning opportunities or internships that extended beyond a traditional term length. Really interesting though, right? Being involved in a bigger, longer project correlated with all kinds of metrics of success, right? This idea of thinking about project-based work, it can at least be the start of something like that. And let's look at a few projects. One more slide here. University of Hawaii at Manoa. Have any of you, a bunch of the Yale people have been familiar with this. Do any of you do work with them? They have an online, it's not a credentialing program, but maybe a badge program, Stefan, is that right?
It's a badge.
Badge program that actually helps you to do some of this work in interesting ways. And here's an example of a project from the University of Hawaii. This was a Japanese project that was focused on Japanese-English translation, all right? So they noticed, the students noticed, and the instructor noticed, they're trying to figure out a project. And part of project-based learning is having some sort of student agency in deciding what they're going to be working on, right? There were no campus maps in Japanese. And as you would well know from the position of Hawaii, you have a tremendous number of visitors from Japan and international students from Japan. So they actually translated the campus map into Japanese. Now, again, if you're focused on, say, headlines, or if you've looked at campus maps carefully, with a linguist's or a language educator's eye, it's a weird genre of language, right? It's truncated syntax, a lot of abbreviations, of which are kind of trivial, but how do you get that into hiragana, katakana, or kanji, right? And they did a really interesting job as a term project that for many of the students extended beyond that semester length period, right? And it had a social impact. It's now, well, firstly, the chancellor, Yumiko Tateyama was the instructor for this course. The chancellor gave them an award and acknowledged their work. And you see now on the University of Hawaii campus, I happen to be an external, external evaluator for this National Foreign Language Resource Center, which is a sweet gig, by the way. If they ever ask you to do it, I would recommend you take it. Because you get to go to Hawaii quite frequently. But you actually see a course project posted all over campus now, right? I mean, that's a really interesting dynamic, I think. And the students were highly motivated. Many of them worked many more hours on this than they did in other term projects because it had a larger value, right? And another example from a Chinese language course that was focusing, and you mentioned that there's something coming up on sustainability or green technology or what have you. So environmental stewardship and issues, some of them cultural, but mostly environmental related to Hawaii. So this is a project-based language learning poster session that was available not just to language sections, but to the whole campus. And admittedly, it was mostly people interested in Chinese language, but you can see that all projects also had an English language abstract, right? But because of the nature of what I could capture, these are very large projects. You can see the start of another thing here. These are the big project boards that you see at conferences, right? If you've ever presented a poster or seen poster sessions. And so there are a whole bunch of these, including some of these more cultural issues like the Haleakala Observatory, which you probably heard about. It's a very contentious area. The Native Hawaiian community feels as though they don't want another large observatory in what is for them a sacred space. And so there's been a very interesting set of contestations around that. Solar energy, waste management systems. So students in these Chinese language courses interacted with people in the sort of environmental engineering program. They did interviews with people, and they looked at research, and they actually produced these Chinese language posters, right, for this publicly acknowledged and large invitational event that was held on campus, right? And they included local politicians, for example, in the invitations as well. And this is something that language classes could potentially do, right? Or at least many language classes. I was a classicist for a while, so Sanskrit may be a little more difficult. So here's some other examples from project-based approaches. EUO could have things, for example, such as continuing to evolve whatever language you're teaching, a Wikipedia entry in some way. And this would give students an opportunity to choose a topic or theme or something they wanted to be focusing on, and then to iteratively develop that, maybe beyond the length of the course. But service work, letters to Amnesty International, we're a social justice campus. Portland State University students typically are thinking about social justice issues quite a bit. So that was a very successful project that we've engaged at PSU. You could, at the center here at Columbia, why can't there be sort of a multilingual emphasis where you actually have students producing columns or commentary in each publication that comes out of the center? The point is not that everyone can read it. The point is twofold. One, it's very productive for the students to think about an audience larger than the teacher, for example, right? It's also important to visualize the plurality of contemporary culture. And I know that's obvious in New York more than in many places, but I think that's a very nice function, the public pedagogy of visualizing multiple languages and their presence in contemporary publications like even center bulletins or what have you. The problems that I think a project-based language learning approach addresses include agency, you know, as Foucault has described it, you know, the docile body in spaces of epistemological incarceration, which is a very negative view of schooling, but it is one that I think many students actually feel. They feel as though, you know, they get assignments and they do assignments. That idea of agency and choice is sometimes not adequately available, I would say. Long-term collaboration, etc. I get asked quite frequently from people who have considered project-based learning, well, what about grammar? You know, what are we going to do about you know, the broader ability that students may need to really understand the systematicity of language use across register, genre, or context? So this idea came up last summer when I was at the University of Hawaii. What if students actually developed a grammar of use based on the project that they developed? So it will be bounded. You're not talking about a grammar of everything. But you actually develop a little language primer, key lexical items, key collocational patterns, what words glue together more frequently than would probabilistically be the case, right? What kinds of grammatical constructions? Is it passive? Is it third person or first person narrative or whatever? You know, I mean, just have them actually develop and enhance their abilities to think about language grammatically and structurally, but based on work that they themselves are involved in producing, right? To kind of give it a more experiential rootedness. Okay, moving to another project now. We're thinking about the metaphor that we've been using based on Irving Goffman's work is laminating. So laminating the kinds of socially significant communicative activity that happens outside of class with what's happening in classroom context so that you can amplify what might be happening developmentally for students based on increasing the, if you will, linguistic footprint of the language they're learning in other aspects of their lives. Now this, admittedly, was a different level course. It was an advanced placement course at the end of high school. But the idea, as we can see reflected here, and we'll not talk about cultural historical activity theory, it's a Vyatkina developmental model, but in any context, no matter what you're doing, you're always engaged in trying to, your object of activity with an intended outcome. But that process of doing something is inherently mediated by communities, by rules of engagement that structure those communities, and by division of labor. Division of labor, in this sense, in a Marxian sense, it means quite literally what you do, but what you do articulates very closely with the kind of social identity you are performing. So part of what we're trying to do with this project is think about different sorts of social identities or subject positions that participants in language courses can occupy as they use different sorts of social media. So I've written quite a bit about this project, and I'll only talk about ways in which students have described this project, and I'd like to just share two excerpts, right? This is a super quick vignette, this project. But in and out of class, uses of blogs and synchronous chat, etc. One student said, I've noticed that people sort of find their own style of writing a blog, right? And you sort of adopt that as you go, whether it be in English or Spanish, all right? So keep that in mind, whether it be in English or Spanish. And possibly one of the better descriptors of second language acquisition by a non-specialist is this high school student saying, so you have Spanish and some messaging and being clever, using words well. You know how it is. You have to make up a personality using words. So you have to do that in Spanish. Now, this is a high school kid, right? I, at university, rarely had students talk about language and a new language as a way to be clever, a way to be liked, a way to be a good interlocutor, to make friends, to be able to participate as an expert, or a mentor, or a confidant, right? Those are the reasons to learn language, right? Language as an intellectual exercise will have a limited, I think, outcome for most students. Some, of course, will be able to do almost anything. But for the vast majority of students who think language is too hard, we just had a faculty senate meeting at Portland State University, just a brief aside, and the English department wants a BS degree instead of a BA degree, which I don't oppose necessarily. However, a BA degree requires 2 years of foreign language study. A BS degree does not. And it came out in this faculty meeting that the English department chair said, well, okay, here's the real deal. Students who get A's in our classes, they just can't learn languages. Right? I mean, complete monolingual bias, right? Complete monolingual bias, unreflective. This is a professor of English, right? I was shocked, frankly. But of course, if you treat language as an object, as though it were in a museum, you can learn a lot about the object, but proceduralizing a new semiotic reserve of meaning potential is incredibly difficult, as we know. I mean, for kids, you know, everyone's always so surprised how rapidly and easily children learn language. But you have to think about the thousands of hours that they have as sort of passive recipients or being generally exposed to language before they're actually actively producing it. And so this whole idea of actually seeing students relativize English, which for all students in this study was their native language, right? And their foreign language. It's like, you know, English and Spanish, you just sort of learn how to perform a personality, create an identity. I mean, that is a remarkable shift in an understanding of what foreign language learning is about, right? Now, I've, of course, as you do, and these sorts of things, theorize this in a number of ways. My earlier work on top, I've really been looking at the centripetal force, so people engaging in language socialization practices and online environments, and the ways in which those dimensions to online socialization outside of school came to influence the ways that they use digital tools in classroom context. It was very interesting at the time, certainly, when the internet was newer. But in this instance, you see foreign language activity in classroom context centrifugally spiraling out to impact ways in which students use their foreign language in social contexts volitionally. over instant messaging. They actually took, this was in the era of blogging, when blogging was so popular, they took their Spanish language blogs and posted them on their general social blog. It had nothing to do with school, right? And Facebook will post things like this. And of course, you get odd responses. People are like, what are you doing? And in Spanish, well, that's kind of cool, but I can't read it. And they're like, well, I learned so much from doing this, I wanted to share it in my personal social space, right? So you find this it's just a really interesting process. And if you look at the work, Vyatkina-informed works with Jean Lave, you've probably heard of the communities of practice model, right? Identity and development, or put it the other way around, fundamentally, development is about becoming a kind of person across historical time, right? And when you move language learning from an object of reflection to a resource for enacting, producing, and engaging a kind of social identity of relevance, I think we're really making a big step forward. Okay, so many of you are familiar with this next project type. Online intercultural exchange, also called collaboration. I've written quite a bit about this, but other colleagues have as well, of course. How many of you do this? A little bit, Francisco? So, it's incredible to me that almost 25 years after the broad availability of internet communication, that foreign language learning remains hermetically sealed in classroom spaces. And that's not condemning, right? But it's an interesting observation. And they're very difficult to do, to set up these exchanges. You know, you always get the question, how do you evaluate what students do with these online intercultural interactions? I mean, there are many things that might inhibit us. Finding a good partner class, being able to organize a shared curriculum, right? Moving beyond the, hey, how are you? I'm fine. How many brothers and sisters do you have? Or do you like, Blink 182 or whatever the band is? Right? We get a lot of that in these sorts of environments. But this is a really powerful tool, and I'm going to show you something that is very linguistically form-focused that came out of one of these projects. So first thing, so Nina Vyatkina, I was on her dissertation committee, and she's published this work subsequent to this. In terms of why, you can read the slide, but why do online intercultural exchange? You're familiar with the Mark Twain line, right? I was greatly discouraged when upon arriving in France, I found no intermediate French speakers there. Yeah, I mean, why wait? I mean, all of us have had that experience. How many people speak at least 2 languages here? Yeah, everyone in the room, right? So when you first are moving, and I learned almost all of mine as an adult, late teen, early adult, right? And I've taught in order to do a university, right? I mean, it's tough sledding, especially when you move from a classroom context to an area where people are actually using the language organically, socially, interactionally, right? It's a very different process. So minimally, there's a whole bunch of good reasons to consider doing this, but minimally, we want to think about it because it just sort of breaks that frame that language is an object of reflection rather than a resource for action, right? That's the key theme here, right? And plus, when you think about developing language abilities, you might think why? Well, one reason in classroom context, the exchange value dynamic that undergirds education, organized education more generally, you do something for something else, right? An exchange value dynamic, quid pro quo, right? Tit for tat. So you do something to get a grade or to achieve eventually your degree. Nothing wrong with this per se, but an online intercultural exchange model is really privileging a different kind of dynamic, which is how can I use language to generate or develop and maintain social relationships of significance. It's a different project. It's a very different project. So let's look at what she did, Nina Vyatkina. Germanists, I know we have Slavicists in the room. Yes. Up at Yale, there were maybe twice this number, and not one German instructor. Couldn't believe it. I said, what's happening to German? I mean, it's tragic. I mean, German is on the decline. I know, it is. So help us bring back German. I'm not a Germanist even. I just love the idea, and having representation in the academy is important. Okay, so modal particles, which some of you would be familiar with anyway. Small words, indeclinable small words typically. These are sprinkled throughout English, and these are not very good examples in English of precisely what modal particles are in German. but they act as sort of epistemic markers, they can soften things or strengthen things, they can sort of help engender a social bond, right? They do a ton of work. However, they are really treated very poorly in traditional curricular materials. It's hard to teach. It's not a rule-governed system because it's entirely contingent on social relations and the dynamics between people and the kinds of social proximity or social distance that you want, whether you know it or not, to produce as you engage in linguistically mediated interaction, right? So she chose this as a topic, understanding that classrooms, because of the teacher-student power dynamic and usually an age gap as well, it's less likely to have naturalistic, free-flowing use of things like modal particles when you're in a classroom context. It's a more formal context, right? Similarly, if you're talking about why students would use German in this case, but any language, probably at least a good chunk of that is to make friends, to hang out with age peers, right? And to do social things with the language, right? So it's really an important area and a very difficult one to teach. So again, online intercultural exchange, German learners of English and American learners of German in interaction together. Ja, nimm doch mal aber, right? Were some of the focal modal particles that she looked at. And she engaged in a very, now, so let me just, don't try this at home, right? Do try this at home, but this was really labor intensive, right? Really labor intensive. The DDL format, a data-driven learning format, and I'll show you some examples here, it won't be a mystery. But she had them engage in this computer-mediated communication interaction with the Germans, right? Then she took that data, right? She actually took the chats, the emails, etc., pulled them out, analyzed them, and then developed teaching materials, not about use of modal particles generically or generally, but based on the discourse the students had actually participated in directly themselves, right? So here's an example, right? And then they engage in more, So, in this excerpt from chat with our German partners, right? So they've seen these utterances, what lexical category or part of speech are the words ja, mal, aber, what do they belong to, right? Can you list other words belonging to this category, right? Just general awareness raising stuff with examples from their synchronous chats, right? Then she used, this is a concordance line, so for corpus linguists, right, you have left and right context, so you can try and understand not just an individual lexical item, but what it is doing in broader context, right? So she showed, developed a number of these, and she just said, so look at the finite verb. What's going on there? What is that verb doing? And what about the co-occurrence of, in this case, mal, is helping that verb and that sentential structure more generally, or clause structure generally, to do the work that it's doing, right? And again, this is all discourse that they had participated in as students. So look at some of the results here. So before the intervention, pre-intervention, when she was developing all these data-driven learning materials, the American students used virtually no modal particles. Virtually none, right? And then post-intervention, you see the Americans using a bunch more, right? Now let's look at the same data. This is not, I gave a talk recently on methodology for research, and I use some of this as an example. A data dispersion chart, if you've seen these. So this is time, right? And here you have the learners, the American students, and the native speakers. Here you have the modal particles on offer. So what do you notice at the top? Right? So you see virtually no modal particle use. Intervention happens, and you start seeing a bunch more. What else do you see in this data visualization?
The native speakers decide to.
Yeah, so why is that?
Learners can handle it.
The learners can handle it. Maybe this idea of learning language through developing and maintaining a social relationship of significance that's proximal is actually a feedback system, right? When was I use this example, it was totally off the cuff, so today is less off the cuff. Probably won't work as well. If you're male and like bro culture and all this sort of thing, I have my son who's 11 talking to me about this all the time, trying to learn to be a guy with other guys, right? When you finally call someone dude, like, hello, nice to meet you, Chris. Great, and then, exactly. And later, like, I'll see each other, like, dude, hey, what's going on? You know, like, when does that happen, right? And what does it mean? Well, it means there's a greater social proximity. You're not showing each other big hierarchical imbalances, right? When you're dudified on the inside, you're feeling good about that relationship, right? Modal particles kind of work like that. From a much more human behavioral theoretical vantage point, humans accommodate each other. And whenever you have maybe a limited English or whatever your language is, a person who's trying to work with you, you modify the way you speak. We can't even help it. I sound like an idiot if I'm speaking with someone who doesn't speak one of my languages well, but I'm trying to use that language and share that language. You realize after the fact, you are not presenting yourself verbally in the ways that you would normally with an expert or native speaker, right? And it's because we constantly accommodate each other. We attempt to achieve an intersubjective state where that temporarily shared horizon of social knowledge can maintain itself, right? So we know what we're doing together. We know what's happening informationally, but also pragmatically and social actionally, etc. So this is really an interesting little piece of data. What's another question you would want to ask about this project? They're using a lot more modal particles. So what, as an educator, would you want to know, besides the fact that they're using more?
I mean, I would be interested in how the particles that don't translate into English, don't have English equivalents, are acquired, because clearly the ones that are not present in English are pretty absent from those plots as well.
So that's one piece, right? Is looking at when you don't have an obvious
That you don't
ready
include.
translatability, yeah?
I'm wondering, what they're able to learn, probably not in this, but after they step out about register, right? Because a certain intensity of these modal particles not be appropriate for this kind of discourse.
Absolutely. So when would you and when would you not want to use modal particles, right? Maybe you need social distance. Maybe you need a more professional discourse in many contexts, right? Another thing that people might want to ask is, are they using modal particles appropriately or accurately, right? And some of that came out in this study. The vast majority of modal particle usage during this was actually the initial phase of the intervention, showed that in fact they were doing a pretty good job of this. So this idea of data-driven learning is so you take data of, and in this case examples of the actual discourse that students have participated in themselves, and then visibilize linguistic assets that were not noticed, maybe even for some students, and certainly not incorporated into their repertoire prior to the intervention, right? This is a very powerful idea, this mediation, the scoop-like idea that we showed earlier about people figuring out, firstly, that a linguistic resource or asset exists, and subsequently figuring out how to use it and what kinds of, not just denotational or connotational functions it has, but social actional functions it may also have. If you're, we talked at the beginning about some of the difficulty of online intercultural exchange, finding partners, figuring out a good pedagogy, assessment methods, how you can incorporate different sorts of projects that students would do together in a transatlantic or trans-Pacific or north-south interaction, right? This is a project that I worked on for 3 years with colleagues in the EU, Erasmus-funded project. So lots of resources not answering necessarily, but providing information about all of those questions, including a partner finding function, right? So there are classes all over Europe, but increasingly now South America, parts of East Asia that are now registering, and you can actually find classes that you can engage with your foreign language classes. Okay, now moving again a little bit further out of our tier. So you have in-class activity. This is class related and class inspired, but we're sending kids, we call it, students, out into the world with mobile devices, right? This is this augmented reality approach, right? And the 503 Design Collective, by the way, is this club, my lab, it's my lab. We're very poor and underfunded, but we produce lots of research papers. And I have undergraduates, graduates, and faculty just showing up once a week. I take them for beer afterwards, so I bribe them. And it's great. We've done quite a lot. As this group has evolved. I just want to thank a number of people. We work as part of an international collaboration, mostly with Scandinavians, so Icelanders, Finns, and Danes. But we have a very established network looking at learning in the wild. We're producing right now an edited volume on this topic. and has some grant funding. So what is this augmented reality approach? Do not be bashful. Have any of you done augmented reality? Pokemon Go, for example, or other things. So you have your phone, right? And some of you may have heard of this example. It's a pretty famous example. One of the tools we use for this is called Eris. And this is actually on the University of Wisconsin campus. 1967, this is a contemporary photo. But in 1967, Dow Chemical Company came to recruit engineers. 1967, height of the Vietnam War, right? And there was a big protest around the Dow company recruiting on campus, right? So this Dow Day, it's called, AR game or activity was designed on campus for journalism students, but it's been also used by language students. So fundamentally, 2017, you're a journalism student and you're told to report on an event that's happening on campus. And so there's an editor built in, like a personification of an editor who gives you instructions like, go to the mall. I hear that there's a protest on the mall. So you walk up onto the mall, right where this is happening, and you can't, it's a little bit pixelated, but this is precisely the same position from which this video footage was taken 50 years ago, okay? So you're on top of the mall, and you watch the video footage of that protest against Dow Chemical Company from 50 years ago as a reporter, playing the role of a reporter, to learn how to do that initial reporting, so you have to write down your notes as you see the video, and then you go to different places on campus and interview people in the very places that those people were interviewed 50 years ago, right? So you have this opportunity to, if you will, sort of semiotically remediate place and to sort of think about intense contextualization of, in this case, a reporting event, but it's one that's linguistically mediated, right? So we have been designing around this theme, and our criteria are fundamentally three. One, we talked about breaking the frame earlier, right, with Tina Segal's work. The most inhibiting aspect to institutionalized educational practice is expectations being met. People come in, they know exactly what to do, they sit in a chair, they wait for the teacher to come in, the teacher comes in, you know, I mean, and look, teaching can be brilliant. I love the artificiality of the foreign language classroom. I love lecturing, I have 150 language primers at home, I love grammar and structure, and you can read through these things, they're organized in very conventional ways. Things that students remember, things that humans develop through, involve breaking the frame, involve unexpected events, right? And those are what stick. These are flashbulb memories, they're sometimes called in the memory research, right? So creating structure so that students can learn. So we have games developed in Hungarian, French, Spanish, Japanese, Russian, etc. And we send students out into the world where not everything is as predictable as a classroom context, right? And then they engage in activities together, and I'll show you some brief examples of that. So one is structured unpredictability. The other, and this is an open empirical question. So my team and I were actually doing video analysis. I'll show you just very briefly how we're doing this research. But we're trying to understand what the effect of intense contextualization is on learning. Because in classroom spaces, you can talk about green technology, you can talk about photovoltaic arrays, or the use of captured rainwater to flush toilets, or whatever, you know. In terms of environmental design, that's what our games are focused on. And we do this all the time in classroom spaces. Is there a difference? Is there a developmental effect from actually being co-present in a material surround that is directly related to the language at play? And it's an open question. I'm enthusiastic about our initial results, but that is what we're exploring with this, and that's what we're attempting to exploit, is this power of intense contextualization, or another way to think about it that's much more linguistically oriented, situated usage events, language usage events, right? So we're doing a whole bunch of work here that also kind of maps to broader contexts of significance. For example, groups of 2 or 3 people looking at Yelp and then trying to figure out what's going on in terms of direction finding, or where they're going to eat or whatever. This is everyday practice, right? How groups or small groups interact around social media in the built surround as they're ambulatory and mobile, right? So some of the cool thing about this project is the ways in which it articulates with just basic social science research, not just language learning or language development. So we've developed these games in Japanese, as I mentioned. I'm just going to show you a few screenshots. And these are very technically simple, not particularly compelling or difficult at a technical level, where you just are given a location on your Google map, and you go to that location, and then you're pushed or can select information relevant to precisely that place where you are. Okay, that's the idea here. The narrative, we found, we've done this different ways in kind of a tour approach, but we found that it's a little bit more powerful when we actually have a narrative front end. So you're from the year 2070, the environment is degraded, you come back in time to 2017 in this case, and you try and find the simultaneous dawn and dusk, as we describe it here, of green technology. So obviously we went back to our egregious fossil fuel using ways, resulting in your really dystopic, environmentally degraded future, right? So you come back to discover the green technologies that may yet give you hope, right, for environmental sustainability and stewardship, right? So that's the nature of the games. We actually have the participants, 2 of 3. We send them out in groups of 3. Francisco, that's your question about does everyone have enough iPhones? We send them out in groups of 3 with only 1 phone. Why only 1 phone? We don't. There's actually, believe it or not, a whole social science research looking at how people use cell phones when they're out in public spaces, right? One of them is if everyone has their own phone, you get divergence. We don't want divergence. We want people having to, pull each other's hands around and talk to each other about what's happening, share information, because it emphasizes communicative dynamic, right? So, so 2 of the students are wearing head-mounted cameras, which fits perfectly with our theme. They're agents from the future, right? And it also gives us, for research purposes, first-person phenomenological, first-person understanding of what it is they're looking at and seeing as they actually engage in these activities. So they run around campus, they take pictures of, Chris back here from Portland, or wasn't Portland, beautiful pictures of Portland, so you'll have to miss Portland for a minute. The photovoltaic array on campus, a place where you can plug in your electric vehicle for free, a car to go, which as you would know is a car that you don't own, but you can borrow when you need one. You see the campus motto here, let knowledge serve the city. In our project, the city is actually serving knowledge in a place-based format. Other pictures, this is our youngest beta tester, who happens to be my son Benicio. So this example that I just mentioned earlier, captured rainwater, what do you do with captured rainwater? Well, so advanced language students are actually producing an extended soliloquy, right? And they're talking in paragraph length about, using it for community gardens, or perhaps purifying it and using it for drinking water, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And students who have more limited capacity with the language, may make much more basic kinds of responses to these queries. And we track them as they move around in the city, responding to this. We do integrate this in the classroom context. We have sort of pre-AR experience activities. They do the activity, and then they come back and do essays, for example, collaborative written work of varying kinds, including contributing to Portland State University's Wikipedia website in the sustainability area, where it's a sustainability campus. That's one of our branded images. And themes. So we try and incorporate this experientially into what's going on with the pedagogy in the classroom. One of the areas that we're moving toward now is not students playing games we're developing, but creating games. And the technology is simple. Trust me, because I can do it. And I used to be a coder way back in the 90s, but I'm not anymore by any means. So it's something like game creation is, I think, a very interesting pedagogical avenue. Again, head-mounted cameras, views from the head-mounted cameras, so you can see what these look like. We're doing a bunch of multimodal analysis of what's happening, so ways in which the environment actually seems to take a turn to talk, in the ways in which students are orienting to and talking about aspects of their built surround. So talking about bicycle commuting, we're talking about rainwater, we're talking about the photovoltaic array. So this, in a way, is why this intense contextualization is of great interest to us. And this emerged from the project. Initially we did it because we thought it'd be fun for students to experience learning and using Hungarian or Japanese outside of classroom space. But we've become very interested in the ways in which it seems as though the social and material world and individuals in these small groups are enmeshed in very complex ways communicatively. So, you know, they're actually doing these bodily indexicals that reference aspects of the built surround or environment in ways that incorporate that into their communicative gestures in a way that I would argue is impossible in a classroom space because you're not there. So there is a way in which the built material environment actually co-constructs kinds and forms of communicative action, what I'm calling it shifts the morphology of communicative action by being present in these situations. Now, the video we can't see, which is fine, because we're going a little long on time, as I can see. We have some video of students actually playing this game. Hey, welcome, come on in, hey. Actually playing this game on campus. And I wanted to show you with this video, which again, I'm happy to share later, but we actually see some problems here. So the advicatures or disadvicatures, right? We see an actual linguistic problem, right? A student didn't know the word advantage and disadvantage, right? So, by the way, this may seem small to some of you, but learning on the fly, learning in time and place is extremely difficult to document. Extremely difficult. Pre-test, post-test, students are doing better on the quiz, students are doing better on the midterm after the new curriculum we implemented this year, great, right? But how does that happen? Why does that happen? What are the particular catalysts for learning, right? It's almost impossible to know unless you try and open the black box of time and place to do this exploration in real time, right? So we see these issues, and then in the blue here, you see another student actually take over and use more or less, missed the S's, but more or less a correct form of those words. And another video clip that you're imagining now, which is really compelling, by the way. And you see that in the red here, Reuse, who was the person who was unable to do this advantage and disadvantage in the first instance, a minute and a half or 2 minutes later, is actually using the correct form of this work, right? And in addition, so I've been working with ethnomethodologists, conversation analysts about this, because to unpack micro-interactional dynamics is extremely difficult. And I know that may not be of interest to most of you, but again, all learning happens in time and place. There is no out of time and place learning. The process ontology of the unfolding moment, in good Buddhist terms, is the only show in town. Right? So we need to attend to what is actually happening in that ontological unfolding of time and place as they co-constitute forms of human action and interaction. So that's what this project is looking at, and we find that in this intensely contextualized interaction using mobile augmented reality, you have all sorts of language sharing and enmeshment between communicative action and aspects of the specific context or place where these interactions are happening, right? We have some annoyingly detailed scholarship and research on this that you're welcome to look at, published here, for example, that really unpacks this. And again, if you have insomnia, can't recommend this highly enough. It's quite serious social scientific scholarship that really is micro-interactional. But in terms of thinking about this climb of wildness, this is what the In the Wild group and I are thinking about. You know, I'm the last person to say throw away what's happening in classroom spaces. That's not the point of this talk. And in every single way, teachers are more important than ever in mediating and amplifying experientially rooted approaches to creating conditions for language learning, right? But this project, this mobile project, I think, really shows us that maybe we don't think about a linear or Tilo-style progression for learning, but these rhizomatic structures, where you have structured unpredictability and perhaps unpredictable ways in which meaning, context, and language use interplay. We're also working, if you notice, in this area of sustainability, right? And part of what Ian Mogos, the philosopher, but also game designer, has described is the procedural rhetoric of social ontologies and epistemological surrounds are really important. So one of the things we're doing here. We have monster truck driving, Eastern Oregon students who couldn't give a hoot about not driving to work or sustainability or whatever, playing these games, and they take the role of an agent from an environmentally messed up future, and they have never been so keen on discovering aspects of green technology. I'm not trying to stereotype anyone here, but the idea is you give them a kind of way to explore green technology, environmental stewardship in a language class in a way that has this, as again, Bogle's term, procedural rhetoric, this softly spoken a presentation or unfolding of a reality that you contribute to and participate in, right? Because no one needs another bulleted list of why environmental stewardship is important, or how combustion vehicles and all that are contributing to global warming, right? It's not going to help. So this idea of actually thinking about giving people active stances in production of kinds of knowledge and social actions that relate to these themes is kind of a subtext for the ways in which we've been developing these games. All right. The last thing, this is very short, investigation of language use and learning in the wild. By the way, let me just ask you a quick question. Why should you care about informal learning or learning outside of classroom context? I mean, we are educators in institutions of higher learning, right? So it is, and I've had this discussion quite often, is it beyond our purview to think about how we structure or encourage engagement outside of our classroom confines, right? So in response to queries I got related to that, I actually looked at some early work. Elaine Thorne is the name some of you may know from the second language acquisition literature. And she did a really interesting study where there was this, admittedly, the context is very different. 6-year-old boy, right, from China, immigrated to the US, in school, English medium, right? And she simply looked what was happening in terms of language production by this kid, controlling for time in 3 different contexts, right? First context, with the teacher, all right? So you have, 260 utterances, 0 complex structures showing up in interaction with the teacher. Controlling for time with students in class, you have a 10-fold increase, basically, in volume of language use. And you see the emergence of complex structures within the classroom context. What happens on the playground, right? You see the trajectory, right? On the playground, you get a more than doubling of the volume of language production by this kid, and you get an approximate 5-time increase in the emergence of complex structures, right? So really interesting, tying this in with intense contextualization and the relationship of social material as well as institutional kinds of contexts and their effect on language use. You really see a lot going on here. So, taking this as a starting point, what do you do with Conchita Wurst, for example? I just did a piece with Dejan Ivkovic looking at the Eurovision song. So I have to laugh when I say it almost, but looking at the Eurovision Song Contest. This was the winner, by the way, 2014. Eurovision Song Contest. And if you're teaching a European language, less helpful for Vietnamese and other languages, I apologize. But in the Eurovision Song Contest, every nation state can put forward a submission, right? So look at the YouTube comments fields underneath the submission, and this is huge for Russia, massive. Dima, right? Is that right? All that? Yeah, you're just like, brr.
Inappropriate language.
Inappropriate. Well, but so no, great. I'm so glad you said that. So what do you do about that? Ignore it?
They try to use and identify it.
Well, I mean, but this is because there is nothing not real about this. I mean, you look at the volume of interaction on these sites, and I'm not saying you should look at it as though this was literary expression or even appropriate in most contexts. But you also find some absolutely compellingly interesting plurilingual interactional dynamics where Russian speakers will post something in Cyrillic, then they'll post it in English or French translation, and in each time they're saying the quote-unquote same thing, but to a different audience, and they subtly modify their language in ways that we describe as linguascaping, based on the metaphor of landscaping. So within landscaping environments, you can change or modify the physical environment, but only within limits, right? If it's a cliff face, or if it's a really rocky soil, or it's on a hillside, you can't do anything you want. You're limited, right? Just as you are with language, to create discursive realities, both for yourself and other people. You're limited in what you can do. But there is an opportunity to create these ethno-linguistic identifications that are very complex, or contest others in ways that are really interesting in these sites. So I'm not saying you should drop your regular curricular materials. What I am saying is there's nothing not real about this. And for many people who are interested in contemporary culture, this is actually one of the cauldrons within which contemporary culture is not just manifest, like visible, but produced, right? Carried out, enacted. So very interesting, right? Let's go in an area that's much less controversial, fan fiction engagement. It is probably the most powerful tool that I've been using, at least, for teaching writing. If we were writing Harry Potter style novels, we wouldn't be in this room because we'd be very wealthy. We'd pay other people to come and be our proxies in this room, maybe, and they could report back much shorter than I've done about what happened in this talk. But creating a figured world is very difficult. Being a successful literary author is extremely difficult. However, continuing a storyline, or doing what's sometimes called Mary Sue fan fiction, inserting, teen pregnancy or hating your parents, into a storyline, it can be a very powerful way for someone to actually experience writing in a way that's significant. Fan fiction communities, I mentioned Rebecca Black's books here, she's great. Her ethnographic study of 2 years of a pseudonym author named Nanako in her work, she received over 2,000 responses to her fan fiction work. So it's a very interactive environment with people doing all kinds of interesting things. Students can choose whatever they want to look at here. I just chose a few Japanese examples. Naruto is a very interesting one, for example. If you want to see discussion of research on the use of fan fiction in teaching language and writing, we have a review of that work here in the annual review of Applied Linguistics, published a little over a year ago. Which you can go through if you're interested in ideas. Another in the wild example is massively multiplayer online games. These are two of my avatars. I get asked a lot, well, do you enjoy playing a female avatar? Yes, I do. It is awesome. That's my response. You can ask me more if you want. But these massively multiplayer online games are really interesting environments. They are incredibly semiotically complex environments, believe it or not. I was constantly told, not asked, told, that gaming environments are for hormone-addled, attention-deficit children, right? Well, people play games because they're so hard, not because they're so easy. And I didn't bore you with this tedious research project, but I've done a linguistic complexity analysis of video game language. And in World of Warcraft, the most popular massively multiplayer game still today, it's been 10 years, it is extremely complex language. And I can demonstrate that empirically. So if you're worried about being exposed to language that is not appropriate or not difficult or challenging, you would be mistaken. And again, the empirics are in the large corpora that I analyzed to produce complexities analyses, mostly quest texts, right? So it's a very beautiful environment. You meet lots of interesting people in these environments, some of whom take their interaction out into the world in ways that aren't always appropriate. So beyond quest text, for example, we also have participants in these environments giving each other explicit corrective feedback. So the Russian, you'll notice, is a little bit vulgar here. So this is an example of maybe off-putting language. But the key is not that that language isn't appropriate necessarily. It's figuring out when or how to understand and potentially decide not to utilize language that isn't appropriate, but being aware of it is fine. So here we have explicit correction being provided, right? Just as we would in a classroom context. There's very little difference between the kinds of questions about linguistic form and responses that the gamers are giving to each other that would be weird in a classroom context. It's very interesting. We did not expect to find that, by the way. If you're interested in the semiotic ecology and linguistic complexity of an online game world and all of those analyses that I just mentioned, they're available in this paper. And the question is not whether learning can happen in an informal context. Obviously it can, right? And does. Maybe even the majority of learning. As a biological organism, ontogenetically moving through the lifespan, I mean, we only have so much time in classroom spaces. Most learning happens elsewhere. But that's not the question we care, or that's not the issue we care about. What we care about is amplifying developmental opportunities in classroom settings. That's what we do, right? So we developed this model called bridging activities, John Reinhardt and myself. And the idea, my ask, right, is 10% of your curriculum. So 1 day every 2 weeks if you teach 5 days a week, right? Students bring in materials, and I don't care. They could follow European football, soccer, right, and online discussions there. Restaurant reviews in French. I worked with our Chinese flagship students because a group of them were supply chain management focused. Right? Yeah, I couldn't care less about supply chain management, but they didn't know how to talk like a supply chain management expert in China. This is a real problem for them. They could understand the academic papers of how do people do being a supply chain management expert in China. So we found online discussion fora, and we analyzed what are sentence openings and closings like. If you ask a question that receives responses, and you realize in these big anonymous environments or even non-anonymized environments, you ask a question, no one may respond, right? So for people who do get lots of responses to questions, how are those questions framed, right? What are the morphosyntactic realizations that will allow you to be successful in this online discourse community as a supply chain management expert, right? These are all identifiable and learnable linguistic assets. So we can't know what our students may want or need to do socially, interactionally, professionally, recreationally with the languages they're learning. So let them figure it out for us, right? Have them find sites that they find interesting, capture data. I'll talk about the model very briefly. This is the very end of the presentation, by the way, if you're getting antsy. And just have them sensitize themselves to what is it about this text that is particularly interesting, right? Can you think of a genre equivalent text in another kind of environment? How are differences linguistically and stylistically realized in this context that you want to be a central participant in, right? And the model is here, right? They choose whatever the context is: supply chain management, fan fiction authoring, online gaming, Rubik's Cube competitions. Really, it doesn't matter, right? Observation and collection. Actually have them. This is one of the reasons why we do this in an internet-mediated context, right? For the social interaction dynamic, and because you can copy and paste text. You can easily do it in service learning, in study abroad, right? If you wanted students to mic up, it's just the movement to utilizable and analyzable data, right? Which is typically digital text, is much more difficult, right? But you can do it. They could transcribe things. If they really wanted a social interactional thing, then they could go hang out, do video recordings, try and transcribe those, and then figure out how is being a successful person in this discursive community manifest. How are the successful people doing what they do? How do people, greet and leave take, right? Question formation, accepting or declining kinds of opportunities for engagement, whatever, right? These are all morphosyntactically realized. So then after they observe and collect, explore and analyze, and then they create and participate. They actually go back to these communities with a heightened understanding of the linguistic assets that are at the core of these communities, and they attempt to participate, right? Could be, the European song contest or whatever, it doesn't matter. So, I mean, maybe it does to you. Doesn't to me. If they're driving the boat, right, in terms of choice, then I'm going to be happy with it. So, can I give you one little reason why this is a good idea? How many of you know all of the YouTube comments fields hanging off of the Eurovision Song Contest, right? I mean, I didn't until this project. You learn stuff. The students bring in, it's like, I'm totally into online chess. But what I really don't understand is, all the ways in which the chat associated with chess is happening in Bulgarian or whatever your language is, right? I mean, it's a really remarkable opportunity to kind of learn things yourself about a discourse community that maybe you don't know anything about. So all of us, you know, who are typically in the expert or teacher position, also get to be explorers, learners, developing our own linguistic repertoire, even in our languages that we speak natively, right? It's a very interesting process. I've learned a ton by doing this. So this sort of openness, this sort of thinking about language learning from the ground up rather than from textbooks and formal language down. Both are important. I'm not saying formal language is not important, but going for both sides is, I think, pretty interesting to think about. And then maybe we want to rethink what we mean about language competence at the end. Maybe we want to think about ways in which you continue developing as a communicating being across the lifespan. This idea of semiotic agility that Paul Pryor and I have been working on. Very last couple of slides here. One is concluding pedagogical thoughts, right? A pedagogy adaptation, I say, because epistolary conventions, meaning forms of written language, these have changed radically in the last 25, 30 years with the internet, right? They are not going to stop, right? So, I mean, it may not be new to you, but Facebook is dying for young people, right? I mean, everyone's on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. Each time there's a new evolutionary development in technologies, you find subtle shifts in the ways in which semiotic mediation of everyday social, professional, recreational, interpersonal exchange is happening, right? We need to attend to that. We need to be alive with what's happening in terms of the world. Strong purpose activities, right? Having students care about some aspect. I'm a big fan of general preparation for, by teaching the basics of the language. But strong purpose activities, giving students a chance to really dig in. Your roles as professional educators become much more important when you have an open, living language-focused curriculum, right? Because you may not know all the answers, but you can help figure out solutions to interesting social and communicative problems or challenges that students may face in real strong purpose activities that they want to participate in, right? Last slide is so what we want to avoid is this. You're looking forward to online gaming, right? You're so excited, you're ready to move, and you realize, wow, reality, worst game ever. I have so many, and I'm looking at myself here, I'm not pointing at anyone else. I taught Hindi for years. People would come into class, sit down, and I'd be going through, teaching them grammar and everything else. You can see, probably like some of you at this lecture tonight, right? But I mean, it's just stultified. And the idea of creating an opportunity, to borrow from my kids again, where reality, the worst game ever, is maybe the game is the best reality ever. And by that, I don't mean gaming as opposed to everyday, visceral sorts of realities, but the idea of creating opportunities for structured unpredictability, opportunities to really stay au courant with what's happening linguistically, communicatively, socially, and culturally in the languages that you're studying, and really trying to refresh that all the time, can be a very powerful way to at least hope to produce large volumes of effortful engagement that we know correlate with learning outcomes. All right? Tēnā katoa, tēnā katoa, tēnā katoa katoa, right? I gave a couple of keynotes in New Zealand recently. This is what you say in Maori at the end of the talk. Thank you for listening to my speech, but it's very formulaic and very important to say at the end of the talk. Thank you for your attention today. Happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Steve, for your rich talk. Feel free to ask Steve any question you want on this, or on string theory, origami, how to fix professional bikes with multi-tools.
I've been trying origami lately.
Oh, there we go. So please, I'm sure it'll be into. All right, somebody has to dive in. Go ahead, Chris.
Three?
Yeah.
4. Yeah. Yes, sorry. This is Chris.
Okay, I just wanted to comment on the gaming. My children are more or less bilingual Czech English, but my son has learned an awful lot of Russian obscenity by playing online games. And that's the only Russian he's learned.
Yep.
But like a lot of the really exciting stuff in language pedagogy, I'm like, wow, great. But it's hard for me to visualize it with someone who's had less than 3 years of challenge. Just the kinds of tasks you're talking about, I'm having a hard time translating into the kinds of proficiencies I think I can get them to.
So at what level, so some tasks, like the AR game, I think you can do that at extremely low levels, right? Especially if you did, say, mixed groups in terms of proficiency levels. So one of the problems that, yeah, I know, is it going to be impossible?
Well, you're talking about plural students of tech, as if that were a thing.
Too few. But it is true. I mean, so, you know, the adage from materials development, right? You don't, or task-based language teaching too, you don't necessarily change the activity frame, but you do modify what's expected out of the task. So it could be that in an AR format, for example, you wander around and you simply label things at the beginning, like words or short descriptive utterances or what have you, that then could eventually be built up across time. Or with fan fiction, you're probably not going to get that level of writing in the first couple of years, right? Although you do have them write things, so they could maybe begin with the very rudimentary aspects of what if Harry Potter characters were text chatting each other. No, I'm serious. It sounds like a contrivance, but you know, text chat is, you know, where are you? You know, when are we? I mean, you know, you could do something like that. So, what is it? I'm not a Harry Potter fan. I should have chosen something else. Hermione and someone else. Gandalf. No. But you know, but so you could. So there might be a little bit of overly artificial conceit there, but you could imagine trying to figure out some way where they could enjoy a role play experience of some kind, whereby they could, you know, learn through that, but also modify the difficulty of language expected, right? But you're right. I mean, it is the case that you know, the big open world of language use is a scary place, and figuring out how to bring that into visibility in a more controlled classroom context is going to be a challenge. But I mean, I do think there are ways.
I guess this is a comment, but you can comment on my comments.
Yes.
Kind of question. So I was thinking about the issue that you raised briefly about formal language, or you know, the type of language you might learn from a textbook, and how that, what the place of that is versus the place of studying or looking at or reflecting on the language you might see in a chat room, or you know, YouTube comments, or in, you know, sort of digital language that's evolved over the past 25 years in the target language that we're, you know, studying in the foreign language classroom. I was thinking that there might be a utility in saying, okay, look at this piece of text from a YouTube video comment, and then sort of recast that in, you know, in the way that we would have learned it from our textbook. That way you're sort of looking at both sides, and you're not losing, or you're not worrying about, oh my gosh, I haven't adopted the formal way of saying this.
So that's a precise example of a bridging activity that John Reinhardt, who was my collaborator on that project initially in 2008, we've written on it a couple of times subsequent. He's actually done precisely that with students in a social media environment. So what would a Facebook wall post, or timeline post, I guess now, I'm still stuck in 2011 or whatever they changed, but look like if you were you know, writing the same thing, say, to even a different participant, like maybe one of your grandparents, right? Right, and wishing them happy birthday. You wouldn't probably say, you suck, or whatever you might say to somebody, or dude, you know, maybe you wouldn't call your grandmother dude. So the idea is thinking about sort of this semiotic recast that is, again, borrowing from, say, the ethnomethodological tradition. You would engage recipient design. So the same basic idea, but you have to design your message for a different recipient, right? And that is fundamentally what pragmatic awareness and appropriacy, because obviously many of these environments have terrible language in them, right? I mean, you know, the Russian bad words that your kids are learning or whatever, it can be a problem. But if you go to a strategy website associated with a gaming environment, and there's been a lot of research on this, Constance Steinkuhler and Sean Duncan analyzed over 2,000 contributions to an online strategy website associated with World of Warcraft, and 80% or so of them involved some version of scientific method. We tried this, hypothesis generation, by the way, right? We tried this, didn't work, return to base, reconfigured the team, tried it again, didn't work, returned to base, tried it again. It's called scientific method, right? And you find young people writing about scientific method, admittedly in relation to a game, in the regular part of their gameplay routine. So that I find supremely interesting. So you have exposure to all types of language, but I think that the bridging activity model is you can learn a lot by consciously becoming more aware of the relationship between an utterance type, including register and genre and word lexical choice, right? Because you have lots of options, right? As Roman Jakobson reminded us in the paradigmatic frame, you have lots and lots of options, right? You make specific options every time you communicate. The question is it having an appropriate effect on your recipient or on your community, right? This is the supply chain management Chinese student too. It's like, I don't know how to be a supply chain manager, right? We just literally tried to look at the key linguistic assets for the most popular and most central people in that community, and then she attempted to learn to be that kind of person discursively in her Chinese language production, right? And so that kind of thing mapping between one context and another brings up the level of competence to this level of, I think, critical language awareness, right? So you're not thinking about being language competent in textbook, Italian, French, Spanish, Korean, whatever. You're thinking about being able to use a variety of morphosyntactic realizations to achieve particular sorts of social pragmatic or informational relational effects. Yeah?
A follow-up question, if there's nobody else. I don't want to monopolize the time, but
No.
just as a response to that, I'm thinking as a language teacher, what would be the best way to introduce this kind of activity with the students? How much do we want to get into like the frames, or or do we want to? Is there a more colloquial way of putting it to listen to the same?
So for the bridging activity stuff, just to take one point of departure, that probably for the classroom integration piece, that's the one that we have the most experience with. Hopefully, everybody studying whatever the language is will have some interest beyond fulfilling a language requirement. And if they don't have it, maybe we need to really push them. Like, you must be able to find something you care about that involves Italian or Swahili or whatever. You must. This has to be possible, right? So then they would capture and bring in, and maybe you even have like 5 minutes. Students stand up, talk about things that they're interested in wanting to learn about that involves the language, and maybe form teams or clusters where someone is really interested in politics, and there's been a lot of work on this, by the way, but people hanging out on like Le Monde discussion boards, right? How does that work? And then capture examples of discourse, or who are the key players, people who post multiple times a day, what kind of language do they use, if they're popular and successful. They're always trolls, and maybe how do you identify trolls in whatever the language, all types of things you could do, right? But I think the key piece is getting the student agency and choice centralized in that process. And then the class, you or other instructors or more capable students would help be the mediators, but people could come in and just talk about and or show some little bit of data that they didn't understand or wanted to understand better. And everyone would be able to learn through that experience. That's why 1 day every 2 weeks, if you have 10 meetings across a 2-week period, right? You commit some or all of that day to actually things, exogenous influences, things from the outside coming in, and then the power of you as the analyst, as the language expert, to unpack, to attempt to understand and interpret as a communicative event or repertoire could then be the focus of that day. And I think it could be almost anything. And obviously there are going to be limits. You don't want really classroom inappropriate material, for example, or misogyny, or hate speech, or obviously I'm not endorsing any of that, even though it's real, right? I think that might be pushing it a little much, unless you're teaching a course where you're really going there, right? A friend of mine at UC Davis, University of California, Davis, teaches a course on taboo topics in education in a language class, and he tries to bring in like hate words and foul language, and but that's kind of a more intentionally designed environment for that. Otherwise, I think it's just like passion, You know, what's really driving people to want to engage more with whatever the language or language community is. Yeah. What else on your mind?
Other questions? Come on.
Or stuff that you're doing that's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm happy to learn things. Yes.
I want just to say a few things about observation and collection tactics. It works really well, especially in any class when they don't learn something from the textbook, but if they, how many times we got the question, what's the equivalent in the target language of their major is?
Right.
And many times I don't know the answer, so it's just go find the website of a university or something in the target culture and language and find the equivalent there. And that's exactly what observation, collection, and then in a specific situation, language situation.
Right.
I want to say a few things about, however, the example with a 6-year-old Chinese or just child was really compelling. But this is an example, I'm not even talking about the age here, but it was an example of an acquisition, of second language acquisition when the environment. We all deal with foreign language acquisition, which is different.
It is.
And now comes my question about the Modal project. So, for the grouping, how do you group the students and what kind of language preparation is involved in this?
Yeah.
Because if it were the second language acquisition environment, then it's clear. They just go outside and they can work. They can make their way through.
Yeah.
But if it is a foreign language environment, then there should be language preparation involved.
Yeah.
And just that's my question, but one thing this is a great project I was thinking for. There is a lot of conversation right now. How do we teach mixed classes of heritage and non-heritage speakers? And I think this project, mobile project, can be a really good tool where you mix this heritage and non-heritage students. But my question is, what language preparation is involved in?
Great question, by the way. And with the Hungarian in particular, that we're doing that. Also with French.
Okay.
So we have members of the French-speaking community more broadly coming in and pairing with students, and we've been doing this with ESL as well, even though it might be a little less needed, where graduate students in applied linguistics are actually going out with ESL learners on campus in clusters of 3.
Okay.
So you have this, expert, less expert dynamic. So we do, for the games that we're working on, and we have a new one on that's going to be using Unicollaboration, one of the local indigenous languages of the area, which is going to be a really hard one to figure out how to utilize in a successful way, but because there's so few speakers now. But we're trying to, so we do orient them within the sustainability project we're sending them to with key lexical items, right? So they're prepared in some way to talk about issues of sustainability, green technology, and key aspects like recycling and solar power and reusing rainwater, et cetera. So we actually do talk to them about, kind of, if you will, the key linguistic assets associated with sustainability projects that are part of this current AR game activity. The thing we have done less well in our case in Portland is actually doing an interesting job of integrating AR game players with linguistic resources in the community. Here in New York, it would be very interesting to explore that. We have a very large Russian, well, relatively speaking, large Russian diaspora population in Portland, and we have a Russian language flagship program. Now, there are 27 nationally funded flagship programs. Do you have one at Columbia?
No, we don't.
Hunter College does, for Chinese. In any event, we could be doing more with mobile devices where they actually go to Russian-speaking parts of town and visit Russian-speaking, enterprises or shops or whatever, where we have this, structured in the sense that they're told to go there, but really unpredictable potential encounters, including no encounter at all. But in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Julie Sykes and Chris Holden have done quite interesting work with students studying Spanish on campus, going to historically Mexican part of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Spanish speaking. And it's interestingly, I think half a mile from campus, but it is a neighborhood that is not particularly well off. So white students studying Spanish don't go there. So part of the game was getting students to realize and then engage with the community and linguistic resource possibilities within the very place that they were living. So AR was a way, mobile devices, a location-aware mobile device, was used to structure encouragement and interaction and specific kinds of quests and tasks that were related to that area. So we do some preparation in terms of lexical preparation for what are essentially oral narration tasks. Talk about why this green technology is interesting and might yet save your dystopic, environmentally degraded future world, right? But otherwise, they're just sort of sent out. And then we do a revisit, of course, when they come back to class, and we talk about and sometimes look at the captured video, and we help students and the student teacher analyze what resources were not used, what different ways or more embellished or enhanced forms of communication might be possible given the communicative activity that we have on video record now, right? So that students can learn from their actual experience. And again, using their own linguistic experience out in the world, playing this AR game as a foundation for beginning to think about what they could add to their repertoire. So that's the way we've been doing it now. You might have other ideas, and this is, as you would probably know, use of mobile augmented reality still very infrequently found in foreign language teaching circles, right? So we're very much in process in terms of figuring out what pedagogies are most effective, what configurations are most effective. Oh, the configurations. So we initially had students going out with individual phones, right? It was terrible. They wandered around and they looked at stuff and they did a task and they were by themselves. With groups of 3, and I have this interaction data that I could have shown you, they have to be engaging with each other. They have to, and a small pedagogical side point, task design is a big deal, right? A lot of applied linguists, language educators talk about task design. We have an intentionally under-specified task. Go out and report on these green technology sites. The point being, the students have to construct precisely what it is they are doing. And we oftentimes get, and at the beginning we were worried about this, but we get, like, what are we supposed to, where do we go? So route finding language, problem solving language, constructing the task as they go is all part of that experience, right? Which we found to be arguably the most languageful part of the process, not doing oral narration tasks that we designed the game to elicit. It's the whole orientation to that is by far voluminously, volume in particular, the most interesting part of that whole pedagogical intervention. So
let me ask one more question, or do you want to go straight to the food and wine and grab Steve and speak to them one-on-one? Oh, you got a question.
But it's okay.
One more question. Go ahead.
Yeah, we can ask during wine if it's. But it's actually, I'm going to be my question is, excuse me. What do we do with the students who are not interested in technology? Because we talk about reality and whatever phones and using, and so because you talk about the students bring their own interest to class, but if it's not technology at all, how do you fit those students in class?
Sure. Well, one thing I would be very curious about, if you have a student, certainly more than 1 or 2 per class, who don't have a phone, I would be extremely surprised.
No, but it's not about the phone, it's about the interest of using the phone for that technology. Because, and I talk to my students in class, and it's not 1 or 2. A lot of my students are just not interested in that type of technology. Not having the phone.
Yeah, no, but so here's the thing though, I think some of it is the way, if you ask someone, would you like to learn language through technology? I don't know how many people would say, oh yeah, sure. Maybe they would, but or maybe they've done Duolingo or some other really structurally oriented, slot substitution, repetition, drilling, and they're like, The point of AR is like, ask your students if any of them have played like Pokemon Go or used Yelp or used Maps, Google Maps. Do you ever use your phone for navigation? If you've used your phone for navigation, you're fundamentally engaging in augmented reality because you have a two-dimensional rendering of space that you interpolate against the three-dimensional sensory surround of the visual world. So you're already doing augmented reality when you navigate using any kind of navigation software. So you're doing it. The question is, so here's an example. You could just have students go and find different places on a map, and they can use their phones to do so, but you don't have to have any technology at all. Just tell them where to go and what to do when they get there. Give them a printed out piece of paper. It would still be augmented reality in that they would be going out into the world and they'd be trying to understand some aspect of the world that maybe they hadn't considered before, or notice some aspect of place that had not been salient to them before that would be encouraged by you, right? So there are many ways, certainly with the AR stuff, I mean, the technology is the least interesting part of it, right? And I don't think the technology is at all obfuscating or, some sort of ponderous burden for students who are, quote unquote, not interested in technology. I think the key is that this is an everyday use of, not even use of technology. This is an everyday action in the world. I mean, it's very few students that now don't use some sort of navigation tool on their phone, for example. And that's all this is. So I think that not fronting the technology part, maybe fronting the exploration of campus part, and you go to campus and need to talk in whatever language you're teaching, Arabic or French or Japanese or whatever, and they could be going and engaging in some kind of communicative task out of the classroom, right? That would be experientially driven, that would involve this sort of structured, because you're telling them what to do, unpredictability of being actually out there in social space where language lives. Language doesn't only live in classrooms, even in foreign language class, right? And you'd be able to kind of figure out a way to increase that experiential dynamic. And that's really the key piece here. I know we're trying to get to this, but let me say one last thing. With a very different kind of population, these are emergent literacy students in Yupik-speaking parts of Alaska. And they had a flood in this very remote village. And everyone in the community was affected. So the teacher had never been able to get the students focused on writing or caring about writing. But every student had an oral story about how that flood had affected their family, their home. Some people had lost dogs, for example, that had been washed, all this stuff, right? So it was a very tragic event for the community, but it was a very experientially rooted opportunity for them to care about communicating about something. So that experience allowed them, or provided them, the catalyst to start learning to write, and they produced, in fact, in the end, a beautiful book that included artwork and pictures and things of this flood event. And there's no reason why, I mean, that doesn't have much of anything to do with technology, but my parallel here is, if you can somehow include actual movement and exploration and use of language in an out-of-class, maybe even off-campus context that could somehow be integrated into the course curricula, I think that there'd be a very powerful learning potential to exploit there. And so by all of this technology that I was talking about, I don't mean to front the technology piece. It's more about what technology affords in terms of providing opportunities for experience. So certainly for the AR stuff, I don't think that the technology piece is an inhibiting one per se. And you don't have to do it with it. You could literally, have a campus map and draw on a campus map and tell students to go places and record themselves doing or talking about something that they could be brought in and revisited in a classroom context. And I think you'd be surprised at how rich the outcome
We'll do that.
would be.
It's just one last question. Do you, with their technology, whatever you guys, all of you guys do, are you including the students with disabilities? Like, is it thinking of students like blind or?
Yeah. So we, in particular, my work at Portland State University, we're a very poor campus, relatively speaking, and the students who attend sometimes have food insecurity, are homeless. I mean, we have a very different student demographic to what you would have here at Columbia, I'm guessing. And so we do attend to disabilities, and in particular, we've been using speech to text for hearing impaired participants in various kinds of language courses. And so we're exploring how to do a better job of that. But I think that cross-modality use of technology can be really powerful. I don't know if you're familiar with some of the less slow literature. It's like it's lower socioeconomic, low literacy populations. And so some uses of technology, this is a little bit more technology-centric, but you have object readers now available on most smartphones. So you can hold a phone over a menu, for example, and it will translate into another language. Or you can hold a phone to an object, and it will provide you either sound propositions, so voice, if you're, say, visually impaired, or text propositions, if you're, say, hearing impaired, descriptions of various objects in the environment. So one of the immediate, and we're hosting sorry for not knowing the exact acronym, but it's lower socioeconomic, low literacy populations. And we're hosting the conference at Portland State University this August. So we're precisely exploring ways to look at low literacy populations, but also at learning or various kinds of disability participants in our classes, and figuring out ways to allow technology to help improve or enhance opportunities for learning and engagement outside of classroom spaces. And that's mostly using mobile devices. But it's a great question, and I think it's an important one that oftentimes goes more or less overlooked, at least in many places.
All right, thank you, Steve. Wine enhanced reality. Wine enhanced reality.